Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. What does the hooks section in an app spec file define? Actions to execute at different stages of deployment. Load balancer configurations. Database schema changes. CloudFormation stack updates. The hooks section in an app spec file defines actions or scripts to execute at different stages of the deployment process in AWS CodeDeploy. What role does the AWS CodeDeploy agent play in the deployment process? Sends notifications through SNS. Monitors database performance. Manages deployments on instances. Analyzes network traffic. The AWS CodeDeploy agent installed on instances manages the deployment process. What is an application ID in AWS CodeDeploy? IAM role for deployment. Identifier for deployed applications. Amazon S3 bucket name. Secret access key for deployment. An application ID in AWS CodeDeploy serves as an identifier for deployed applications. What does an application revision represent in AWS CodeDeploy? A version bundle of application files. A security group for EC2 instances. A CloudFormation stack. An instance type for scaling. An application revision in AWS CodeDeploy is a snapshot or bundle of versioned application files ready for deployment. What happens to instances in an all-at-once deployment strategy in AWS CodeDeploy? Updated after manual approval. Updated simultaneously. Updated sequentially. Updated based on instance type. In an all-at-once deployment strategy. What AWS service allows AWS CodeDeploy to deploy applications on-premises? AWS Snowmobile. AWS OpsWorks. AWS Snowball. AWS Storage Gateway. AWS OpsWorks allows AWS CodeDeploy to deploy applications on-premises using an integrated approach. What is the typical deployment flow in AWS CodeDeploy? Deploy revision. Launch instances. Register application. Create deployment group. Configure load balancers. What is a Lambda deployment in AWS CodeDeploy? Optimizing Amazon S3 storage. Automating EC2 instance launches. Managing RDS databases. Deploying code changes to AWS Lambda functions. A Lambda deployment in AWS CodeDeploy involves deploying code changes to AWS Lambda functions. What is the role of an app spec file in AWS CodeDeploy deployments? Creates CloudFormation stacks. Manages database schema changes. Defines deployment actions and hooks. Configures load balancers. An app spec file in AWS CodeDeploy defines the deployment actions. What does AWS CodeDeploy use to define the sequence of deployment actions? IAM policies. Amazon CloudFront. AWS Directory Service. AppSpec file. AWS CodeDeploy uses an AppSpec file to define the sequence of deployment actions and configurations for application updates. What is a benefit of using AWS CodeDeploy for deployments compared to manual methods? Lower instance costs. Faster instance provisioning. Consistency and automation. Improved load balancing. AWS CodeDeploy provides consistency and automation in deployments. How does AWS CodeDeploy manage deployments across different Amazon VPCs? Uses VPC peering or VPN connections. Utilizes Amazon Route 53 for routing. Requires manual IP address configurations. Deploys only within the same VPC. AWS CodeDeploy manages deployments across different Amazon VPCs using VPC peering or VPN connections to ensure connectivity. Which AWS CodeDeploy deployment configuration allows you to deploy to Amazon ECS services? Lambda. Amazon ECS. Elastic Beanstalk. EC2/on-premises. The Amazon ECS deployment configuration in AWS CodeDeploy supports deployments to Amazon ECS services. Which AWS service can AWS CodeDeploy use for automatic scaling during deployments? AWS Batch. AWS Auto Scaling. AWS Step Functions. Amazon SNS. AWS CodeDeploy can integrate with AWS Auto Scaling to automatically adjust instance capacity based on deployment needs. What does the compute platform represent in AWS CodeDeploy? CloudFront distribution configuration. IAM role for deployment. Target environment for deployment. Instance scaling metrics. The compute platform in AWS CodeDeploy represents the target environment. How does AWS CodeDeploy verify the health of instances during a deployment? Through configurable health checks. By querying DNS records. By analyzing security groups. Through CloudTrail logs. AWS CodeDeploy verifies instance health during deployment using configurable health checks to ensure successful updates. How does AWS CodeDeploy manage application rollbacks? Sends notifications for manual rollback. Updates IAM policies. Automatically reverts to a previous version. Pauses deployment for review. AWS CodeDeploy manages application rollbacks by automatically reverting to a previous version if deployment issues occur. Which AWS CodeDeploy deployment method verifies the new deployment's health before fully deploying? Rolling deployment. All-at-once deployment. Canary deployment. Blue/green deployment. Canary deployment in AWS CodeDeploy verifies the new deployment's health on a small subset of instances before proceeding with full deployment. What is the primary advantage of using AWS CodeDeploy for deployments? Automation and scalability. Global content delivery. Data storage encryption. Real-time analytics. The primary advantage of AWS CodeDeploy is automation and scalability in deploying applications across AWS services. Which deployment method in AWS CodeDeploy involves testing new versions on a small subset of instances first? Rolling deployment. Blue/green deployment. All-at-once deployment. Canary deployment. Canary deployment in AWS CodeDeploy allows testing new versions on a small subset of instances before rolling out to the entire fleet. What is the role of an application revision bundle in AWS CodeDeploy? Monitors VPC traffic. Manages instance backups. Optimizes load balancer configurations. Contains versioned application files. An application revision bundle in AWS CodeDeploy contains versioned application files prepared for deployment. What is a deployment lifecycle event in AWS CodeDeploy? An AWS Lambda function. An Amazon S3 bucket. A stage in the deployment process triggering actions. A CloudWatch metric. A deployment lifecycle event in AWS CodeDeploy represents a stage or step in the deployment process that triggers specific actions or checks. Which AWS CodeDeploy deployment type allows rolling back to the previous version automatically? All-at-once deployment. Rolling deployment. Canary deployment. Blue/green deployment. Blue/green deployment in AWS CodeDeploy allows automatic rollback to the previous version if issues are detected during deployment. What is the maximum duration a deployment can be configured to run in AWS CodeDeploy? 1 hour. 24 hours. 1 month. 1 week. The maximum duration for a deployment in AWS CodeDeploy can be configured up to 1 week. What is the primary role of the deployment configuration in AWS CodeDeploy? Defines deployment rules and options. Optimizes CloudFront distributions. Manages Amazon RDS databases. Configures Amazon ECS services. The primary role of a deployment configuration in AWS CodeDeploy is to define deployment rules. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.